Welcome to EMDR with Alice. Today we're going to talk about when to use cognitive interweaves. There are four main times to consider using cognitive interweaves. So let's talk through those. So one of the times that it's important to use cognitive interweaves is when a client is blocking or looping. How do you know that's happening? So if a client is blocking, it's every time you check in that feedback portion where you say, what are you noticing now? And they're giving you the same information over and over, at least 3 times in a row, then there's a block that's happening. And so that might be a time to use, that would be important to use a cognitive interweave. And so we would use the cognitive interweave that matches with the block. So if the block has to do with a body sensation, then we would likely use a somatic-based cognitive interweave. If the block has to do with an imagery not shifting or changing or being kind of stuck in an imagery, then we would use a cognitive interweave that works with the imagery. If the block has to do with perception, a childhood perception of something and stuck in that childhood perception, then the cognitive interweave that I would want to use would be bringing in more of an adult perspective. So think about matching your cognitive interweave with whatever's happening within that block. Looping is when it seems like in your session the client is moving and shifting, but then we keep coming back to the same thing. And so they kind of still seem to be stuck, even though it seems like progress is happening, but then all of a sudden we're coming back to another point we thought we'd already worked through, and it seems like we just keep kind of coming back to this thing over and over. And so again, the same thing is we want to be curious as a clinician, what are they looping around? Is it a sense of shame, responsibility, safety? One of those categories that typically blocks show up in when we're working with trauma. And then we want to match our cognitive interweave with wherever the client seems to be looping. Another time we want to use cognitive interweaves. So first is if they're blocking or looping. A second incident in which we would definitely want to use cognitive interweaves is when a client is out of their window of tolerance. How do we know a client is out of their window of tolerance? They are checking out, feeling numb, feel disconnected from their body or the room. They're taking too much time to answer when you do your check-in, like they're kind of staring off into space and then seem to kind of come back to the room. Those are all examples that they're out of their window and they're more in their trauma responses. Or if they're kind of in a panicky, so sometimes panicky for clients can look like hyperventilating. It could look like fast, rapid breathing, big, wide eyes, panic look on their face. It could look like crying, but no resolution with the crying. And so I call that more the scared cry. So if those are happening, any of those things are happening, the client is out of their window of tolerance and needs a cognitive interweave to connect them back to present and their present sense of safety. And so that can look like just pausing and doing like an orienting response where you just invite them to take a moment and look around the room, remind themselves where they are. I have them count my plants. As you can see, I have several in the picture here, but I have several plants around my offices. I might invite them to smell because I usually have a diffuser going. I'll invite them to tell me what they hear outside my office because we're on a busy street. And then what do they hear inside the office? We have sound machines, clocks, all those things. And that just brings them back and invites them back into the present moment. And then once they have one foot back in the present, we can go back into the memory and continue processing, but I might do shorter sets. Or I might go a little bit slower with my bilateral and see if that helps them stay within their window. Another way cognitive interweave is if they're feeling unsafe is I might just say, are you safe right now? Can you look around my office? Is anybody here trying to hurt you? Whatever they say, go with that, right? So if I do orienting, it's because they're really kind of in a trauma response and they need inviting back to the present. If they're going into kind of really starting to shift into being out of the window of tolerance, I might be able to just use a little short cognitive interweave question about safety and they can get back in and we can keep moving. Either way, we're going to invite them back into the present and then continue processing. A third reason I might use a cognitive interweave is if we're running out of time in a session and we're trying to kind of help some connections happen for the client. So typically if I'm doing a 53-minute session, about 35-minute mark, I might start doing more cognitive interweaves with a client than I typically would, just to help them start shifting some perspective and making some connections. And remember, with cognitive interweaves, it's always just about the next step. We're not trying to get them to the end because that's too quick. It's whatever's that next step, just to get them to the next level of connecting into their adaptive network. And so you'll use the interweave that would be appropriate based on where they are in the memory. And then the fourth reason we would do cognitive interweaves, and this is just kind of taking into consideration working with complex trauma. I do want to normalize, if you're working with complex trauma, you're going to have to do more cognitive interweaves because there's typically more blocking and more looping that's going to happen. There's more incidences of getting out of the window of tolerance. So you're going to be doing more cognitive interweaves with complex trauma. So just know that going in and kind of be prepared for that. But when you're working with particularly really complex trauma where the client has the potential to go and open too many networks, I might use cognitive interweaves to help keep us on track with one memory so that we're not getting overwhelmed by opening multiple associated memory networks. And so that just might look like every 3 or 4 sets, I come back to target memory. When you come back to the original memory we started with, what are you noticing now? And we kind of start with that. Now that I'm bringing back, it's a little bit more of a restrictive. And I might also, again, bring in a cognitive interweave more often. So that could also look like if they do go into an associated memory, I might say, yeah, what about that first memory we started with? It feels connected to this one. Go with that. So I might help them make that association and connection, but bringing them back to the original one we started with. So 4 reasons to use cognitive interweave. Those are the most common reasons we use cognitive interweaves. I think we have another episode on here you can check out about what are some cognitive interweaves you can use, and we'll have more on that in some future episodes. Thank you for joining us today.